Thank you and good evening. Yes, this is Fiat Lux IV, part 4 of the Fiat Lux trilogy. Fiat Lux was originally Let There Be Light, and I wanted to talk about light and how it affects the way we build telescopes and the way we look out into the universe. And after a little while I thought, colour is so important, it deserves a Fiat Lux of its own. So I decided to write episode 4 of the Fiat Lux saga, Colour in the Cosmos. And because I've been made aware that there's lots of mince pies at the back, I've kept this talk relatively short. So it is colour in the cosmos, but it's actually more about colour than it is about the cosmos. So you'll see at what point I sort of cut things short. I'll give you a little introduction. I'll be talking about the perception of colour, how we as humans see colour. I'll be looking at how we quantify colour, and then looking at part of the cosmos, looking in particular about colours of stars. Can stars be any colour? And if they can't be any colour, which colours do stars fall into in terms of categories? And then I will not be going into the next few sections because that would take us well beyond midnight. So I'll not be talking about nebulae and spectroscopy and other matters, and I'll just summarise at the end. So that's what we're going to do this evening. So firstly, what is colour? That's a very good place to start if we're talking about our perception of colour and colour in the cosmos. Some people say colour isn't real. It's a figment of your imagination, or I prefer a pigment of your imagination. Yeah, and every time I type this in, PowerPoint tries to change it from pigment back to figment because it knows better, of course. So it is fairly obvious that colour exists in some sense, but what you perceive as colour is not necessarily the same as what I perceive as colour. And before I go any further, can I just double check if is anybody in the audience colourblind? Okay, I'm sorry, sir, you may not get everything out of this talk that you ought to, especially one example which requires not to be colourblind to actually make any sense of it. So we can start with, why do we have colour vision at all? Why do humans have colour vision? You could argue it's because otherwise rainbows would be very boring, because if you imagine a picture like that taken without the colour, there's not an awful lot there.
I've seen that from moonlight.
You can indeed see it it's still a colour rainbow, but you don't see it as colours for reasons I'll come to very shortly. So it's widely believed that we have colour vision, for instance, so that we can tell when fruit is ripe, so we eat the right things. Rather than deciding, I'll go and taste that fruit and find out if it's ripe or not, if you can tell from its colour, you can save yourself a journey to the next tree before picking the fruit. So in this particular case, we have 3 fruiting bodies. Does anybody care to guess which, if any of them, are ripe? They're all tomatoes, yes, they're all fruit, but which ones are ripe? Well, with colour vision, you don't have to guess, because with colour vision, it's absolutely obvious which ones are worth eating now and which ones you leave for a little while to ripen. So that's one argument, that's the reason we have colour vision. That's why we've evolved to have colour vision. I think we've actually evolved not to have colour vision to tell if fruit is ripe. I think we've evolved with colour vision so that we can make sense of maps of the underground. Otherwise, it is an absolute rat's nest, but as soon as you put colour in there, right, starts to make sense now. I can see where the lines are. So maybe that's why we've evolved colour vision. So how do we perceive colour? Some of this I'm sure you know, but I'll cover it anyway. Okay, the human eye looks a little bit like this in section. So light is focused by the cornea and the lens onto the retina. And the surface of the retina, which covers a large portion of the back of the eye, is packed with various photoreceptors. Some of them are colour receptors and some of them aren't, so-called cones and rods. There are 3 types of cones that are sensitive to red, green and blue light. And there are rods, which I'll come back to in a little while, but the rods are the ones that are sensitive at night when you don't have colour vision, hence a moonbow, which looks a little bit like a rainbow without the colours. So we have a whole load of photoreceptors there, sensitive to red, green and blue, and they receive the light, they convert the light into a chemical, ultimately an electrical signal, and that signal is sent to the brain. It's not quite that simple, but we'll have a look at the next stage of complexity in a moment. But that, in essence, is what happens. Light is received, light's converted to a signal, the signal goes to the brain. So you could say, well, that's exactly how a camera works, isn't it? If we have a look at what's going on inside a camera, a lens obviously forms the image. The sensitive part of the camera is a chip rather than the retina, and a chip is made not of lots of individual photoreceptors in the biological sense, but the chip, if you look at it closely, is made of a lot of pixels. The pixels themselves are not color sensitive in the sense that they can pick up light and are sensitive to light across the whole of the visible spectrum. But basically when manufacturers make color cameras, they put filters on front of each pixel. They put a red or a green or a blue filter on top of each pixel. And the computer in your camera knows which pixel has got which color filter on top, because that's part of the manufacturing process. That particular way of doing it is called a Bayer grid. And the computer is programmed such that it understands what the Bayer grid is, and so it knows which pixels have picked up the green, which pixels have picked up red, which pixels have picked up blue, and then it uses that information to make a color image. Now, when it comes to what light is let through each of these filters, I used the camera that I had at the time, and we can see that, roughly speaking, if we look at the color spectrum from blue to red, I've also put the wavelengths of light down at the bottom, but let's just use the spectrum at the top to remind us about the colors of the rainbow. We can see that the blue filter lets through, roughly speaking, 1/3 of the spectrum at the blue end. The red filter lets through roughly 1/3 of the spectrum at the red end. And the green filter, not surprisingly, lets through about 1/3 through the middle. And you can see they overlap to make sure that no particular wavelengths are missed. So you might say, well, if that's how cameras work, we can map out the color sensitivity of a camera, and we know that when we take a picture in daylight, we get a picture that looks vaguely like what we saw with our eyes. Presumably, the color receptors in our eyes have a similar sort of color sensitivity to this particular camera. Well, it's a bit surprising to realize that although parts of it look a little bit like that, the eye doesn't work quite the same way as a color camera. When we look at the sensitivity of the human eye, yes, the blue is at the blue end of the spectrum. Yes, the green receptors are in the middle of the spectrum, but look where red is. This is rather surprising to realize that red and green receptors in our eyes are actually very similar in terms of their sensitivity to different colors. So blue and green seem to make a lot of sense, but look at red. Red is actually most sensitive, not actually in the red part of the spectrum. It's actually most sensitive in the sort of greeny yellow part of the spectrum. And notice that the red receptors actually will fire even if the light is blue. Not very sensitive down here, but even blue light will set off the red receptors, and the red sensitivity goes all the way up to the red end of the spectrum. So it's a little surprising to realize that our receptors are not quite in the same sense as the receptors in a color camera. So although I tend to still think of them as red, green, and blue color receptors, biologists never talk about red, green, and blue color receptors for precisely this reason. The red receptor is not sensitive to red light, certainly not red light only. It's actually sensitive to most of the spectrum. So biologists actually talk about the receptors that are sensitive to the short wavelengths and the receptors that are sensitive to the long wavelengths, and not surprisingly the M for the mid wavelengths. I find that too much of a mouthful, so I still call them red, green, and blue. But in addition to having the 3 color receptors, we also have these, the so-called rods. So we have 3 types of cones. These are packed into the retina, especially in the middle part of the retina where we get our most sensitive vision. But the rods are sort of interspersed in between the cones. There's only one type of rod, and they are sensitive to this region of the spectrum. You can see the blue to green end of the spectrum. That's why astronomers use red lights at night. If you want to go out at night and preserve your night vision, the rods are very sensitive to low levels of light, where unfortunately the cones effectively do not work, which is why when you go out at night, you tend to see, for instance, under moonlight, you tend to see no colors at all. Everything looks monochrome. But astronomers will use red light if they want to see something under bright illumination, because if you shine red light, the rods basically do not know the light is there. So you will not spoil your night vision, which might take a little bit of time to build up when the light levels drop. If you use red light at night, it doesn't spoil your night vision because the rods are not sensitive to red light. So you could ask yourself, okay, that's the way it is, but why have we ended up with a trichromatic vision? Why do we have three sets of receptors? They're not quite red, green, and blue, but I'll continue with those labels for the time being, because we're all aware of the fact that if you take red, green, and blue light and mix them together, you get lots of different colors, depending on how you mix three primary colors. But it's interesting to note that some animals, quite a lot of animals, don't necessarily have three-color vision. Some animals have a lot more than three different types of receptors in their eyes. For instance, this joker has got 12 different distinct sets of color receptors. And notice where the visible spectrum is indicated at the top there. It's clear that this particular animal has receptors across the whole of the spectrum and a little bit into the infrared, and 2 or 3 separate receptors into the ultraviolet. We get along quite happily seeing all the colors of the rainbow with just 3 receptors. Quite why this animal needs 12, I don't know. Any guesses as to which animal this might be? Most mammals, like owls, birds, etc., and various rodents, will have the same color receptors as us, unless they are totally nocturnal. Owls might have very sensitive vision, but they don't have 12 sets of color receptors. This joker is a mantis shrimp. Now, why a mantis shrimp needs 12 sets of color receptors, I don't know. I'm guessing that maybe its food fluoresces in the ultraviolet, where it's useful to have a photoreceptor, but quite why you need 12 of them rather than just a couple in the visible and 1 in the infrared and 1 in the ultraviolet. So I haven't looked into the biology, but that particular mantis shrimp has got this particular set of color receptors. And there's various other oddball animals that have various combinations. So why did we end up with 3? 3 is a good number in terms of mixing colors together to get lots of colors, but we haven't always had trichromatic vision. If you go back far enough, for instance, if you go back 100 million years or so, when dinosaurs ruled the earth, we were just these small furry rodents, these mammals, who were totally nocturnal. We were nocturnal because we were small, and we were basically staying out of the way of dinosaurs. Go out during the day, you get stomped on, or you get eaten. So we stayed away from the dinosaurs, and we only came out at night. So we needed good night vision. We didn't particularly need good color vision. But as soon as the dinosaurs died out, we came out during the day when it was safe to do so because there's no more T-Rexes to eat them. So we came out and we evolved, and over 60, 70, 80, 100 million years or so, we evolved and our 3-color vision came back again. Now, of course, we are not the pinnacle of evolution. Who knows where we will evolve next? But 3-color vision is just a good way of seeing color based on the fact that we've evolved from a nocturnal animal. Now, when it comes to thinking about how much sunlight arrives on Earth, we've evolved, of course, because we've evolved with color vision in the color part, in the 400 to 700 nanometer part of the visible spectrum, precisely because that's where the sun produces a lot of its light, and because there's a window in the atmosphere that lets through visible light. In other words, infrared light tends to get blocked, ultraviolet light tends to get blocked by the atmosphere. The sun produces a lot of visible and some infrared and some ultraviolet, but it's the visible light that makes it to ground level. 99, or at least in the high 90s, percentage of light makes it to ground level. Only a tiny amount of light is actually absorbed by the Earth's atmosphere. Only a tiny amount of visible light is absorbed by the Earth's atmosphere. And so, of course, if we want to do astronomy, you can do that from ground level. We can see the stars simply because the atmosphere is transparent at those wavelengths. That is precisely why we can see those wavelengths. There's actually a few other windows you can see if you go to much longer wavelengths. There's actually a radio window where radio waves make it, but there aren't many animals with eyes large enough to see electromagnetic waves with a wavelength of 1 meter. Our eyes are adapted to see wavelengths of a micrometer, a thousandth of a millimeter. The animal would have to be huge if it wanted to be able to detect meter wavelength radio waves. And ultraviolet and other dangerous stuff is also absorbed by the Earth's atmosphere. So if we want to see ultraviolet or infrared part of the spectrum, we can't do that very well if we want to look out into the universe. It doesn't work too well if we do that with telescopes at ground level, which is why we put telescopes into orbit, or at least above the Earth's atmosphere. So various ultraviolet and X-ray telescopes, Chandra and Newton Swift, and various infrared telescopes, such as Herschel Spitzer and most recently the James Webb Space Telescope, they are above the Earth's atmosphere because the Earth's atmosphere would otherwise absorb those wavelengths. That doesn't stop us putting something like the Hubble Space Telescope as a essentially visible wavelength telescope into orbit as well, but that's not because the atmosphere absorbs that light, it's simply because the atmosphere is unstable. Having a turbulent atmosphere means that if you're looking through the atmosphere, the images are a little bit unsteady. Very little light would be absorbed, so there's not much intensity increase by taking a telescope above the atmosphere, but the images are much steadier, so we get more detail in Hubble Space Telescope images compared to the same size telescope sitting on the ground. So let's just return to how the eye works. I said before that we've got photoreceptors there, nominally labeled red, green, blue all the way around the eye, but especially packed into the point on the optical axis where you have your most acute vision and your most acute color vision. But that was very much an oversimplification. Even if for the moment we ignore the rods and just think about the three colors of cones, that little cartoon there is a vast oversimplification of what's actually going on in the back of the eye. The photoreceptors are a whole load of cells, as indicated here, the back, if you like, portion of the retina. But there's a whole load of cells sitting in front of the photoreceptors. These are neuron cells. And you tend to think of neurons as being, well, isn't that what our brains are made of? Aren't our brains just a whole collection of neurons that do all of the processing of information? Well, yes, they are. But there's a shed load of neurons in your eyes as well. So in a very real sense, your eyes are a part of your brain. They just happen to be a sort of slightly disjoint, slightly separated part of your brain. But yes, a lot of processing is done by the neurons that are actually in the retina of your eyes. And that means whenever you see something, it is not simply a question of your retina picking up the intensity of a signal and sending that signal to the brain and letting the brain make sense of what it is you're looking at. Some of the processing is actually done by the neurons in the eyes themselves. You can express this in one particular way by saying, if you think about the light that's hitting the particular pixels in a camera, you can say that, well, yes, the computer in the camera knows that light is hitting particular pixels, so it can work out for any particular region of the chip the intensity of the red, the intensity of the green, and the intensity of the blue light in any part of the image it's looking at. And when it comes to converting that into an image, which ultimately gets saved probably as a JPEG on your SD card of the camera, it's effectively a one-to-one mapping between the colors that are seen by the chip and the colors in the image that you end up with on the SD card and then you look at on your computer screen. In other words, apart from the fact that it might kick the red up a bit and the green down a bit, and it might tweak the color balance a little bit, essentially it's a one-to-one mapping between what the camera sees and what you see coming out of the image at the other side. That is very different from the way that your eyes and your brain work. So you've got a whole load of photoreceptors, which again are picking up red, green, and blue signals. But because what happens next is not that information is sent to your brain, what happens next is the information is picked up by these neurons. And these neurons will process the information coming out of your photoreceptors. It won't simply say, what is the intensity of the red light? What's the intensity of the blue light? Amazingly enough, that is not useful information to you. What matters is, have things changed? Is that blue light different to it was half a second ago? Is that blue brighter than the green? Is the red plus the green more different from the blue than the red minus the green? It does processing of the information coming out of the photoreceptors, and it does processing that it thinks you need to know on the basis of a few million years of evolution. So actually there is a neural network. In the very real sense, there's a tiny brain on the inside of your retina, and the information from the red, green, and blue is processed by this neural network to give an output, which is then fed to your brain down the optic nerve. So the optic nerve does not carry red, green, blue signals from different parts of the retina. It carries information from the neurons about what is going on in the vision, in the field of vision that you're looking at. Your brain would be totally overloaded if every piece of information from every photoreceptor got sent to the brain. So in some sense, this neuron network is actually doing some filtering and giving you the essential information that your brain needs. And with apologies to those of you who've seen this before, because I have included this in past presentations, I think it was 2014 I last showed you this, so with a bit of luck you might have forgotten it. So I'm just showing you how much processing the neural network does when you look at an image. So with apologies to the gentleman who's colorblind, we see a cube here with various colored tiles on it. On the left-hand side, we see a 5 by 5 by 5 Rubik's Cube. I'm interested in the tiles, the 25 tiles on the top face of this left-hand cube. How many of those tiles are blue? A bit of muttering, but basically I think a lot of people said 4. Yeah, okay. Do the same thing with the 25 tiles on the right-hand side. Excuse me, let me stop that moving. On the right-hand side, how many of those tiles are yellow? Maybe 6, but some people think maybe 7. Okay, 7. 4 blue on the left, 7 yellow on the right is the consensus. Are you prepared to put money on that? And you can tell from the tone of my voice that you shouldn't, because the 4 blue tiles on the left and the 7 yellow tiles on the right are actually the same color. They are all 11 of them the same color. And you probably don't believe me. And you think I'm about to cheat. You can tell for yourself by going to this web page in the bottom left of the screen and checking it for yourself that I'm not cheating. What I'm going to do is to take away all the pixels other than the pixels that are in those 4 blue ones on the left and the 7 yellow ones on the right. And if I take those pixels away, that is what you were actually looking at. You weren't looking at blue tiles on the left and yellow tiles on the right. You were actually looking at gray tiles. They are all identical shades of gray. They only looked blue because they were bluer than the other pixels. They only looked yellow because they were yellower than other pixels. In other words, the neurons in your eyes were telling you about color differences. Even though you thought you were looking at actual colors, you were actually being told about color differences. And this is what the neurons in your eyes do, and they send that information to the brain, and the brain says, thank you very much, because I'm only interested in color differences. I'm not interested in absolutes. The same is true, although it's a little bit of a side here because we're talking about color rather than anything else, but the same is actually true of intensity. You think your eyes are telling you that is brighter than that because more light is coming from over there than over there. So you think your eyes can judge illumination. But if I ask you a similar sort of question and say, well, there are 2 squares here marked A and B, it's not the letter themselves. I'm interested in the square on which the letter A sits, and I'm interested in the square on which the letter B sits. Which of those 2 squares is the brighter of the 2? If you think you can tell from your eyes which one is actually producing more light, let me just mask out all of the other pixels in the image. So the shade of gray for square A and the shade of gray for square B, they're not similar, they are identical. I've checked that they are absolutely identical. The shade of gray there is exactly the same as the mask on the left and the mask on the right, and the shade of gray for A is exactly the same as the shade of gray for B. If I then take the masks away, is your brain still convinced that A and B are the same shade of gray? Even though you know it's true, you cannot convince your brain, you cannot override the information that you're being fed. You still see that as, well, it's clear that A is darker than B. It's purely an illusion based on the fact that the image processing that's going on in your eye is overriding what you tend to think is happening. It is not simply registering intensity and then letting your brain judge that is more intense than that, so that is brighter than that. So that's one take-home message from this lecture, is your eyes don't always tell you what you think they're telling you. So how do we quantify color? Let's move back to color in the cosmos. Cosmos shortly. Let's just ask ourselves how we quantify color, given that perception is such a tricky thing. If you ask a physicist, yeah, perception is tricky, so how do we quantify color? A physicist will say a spectrum. And of course, that's what a spectrum looks like for some of us of a particular age. But no, we're not talking about that spectrum. We're talking about Isaac Newton trying to reproduce the front cover of Dark Side of the Moon using a prism and getting a spectrum from sunlight. So we know that white light, or what we tend to perceive as white light, is actually composed of a whole load of different colors. And light will reveal its wave nature. And it turns out it's the wavelength that's important, but we'll see the wave nature whenever we put light through a prism or a diffraction grating or a microscope or a telescope. Ultimately, we will find the wave nature of light coming through, manifesting itself. And what matters as far as color is this parameter, the wavelength, the distance from one crest to the next crest of light. And I've already given these numbers in the previous graphs, but for most humans, we can see electromagnetic radiation if the wavelength falls between roughly 400 nanometers and 700 nanometers. 400 nanometers at the violet end of the spectrum, 700 nanometers at the red end of the spectrum. It's of course not the same for everybody. We're human, therefore not everybody is a clone of each other. So some people can see a little bit further into the infrared, some people can see a little bit further into the ultraviolet. But for most people, it's 400-ish to 700-ish. But all of the colors of the rainbow are not all of the colors, because if we look at the spectral colors, if we look at a spectrum, where's brown? Where's beige? They are not in the spectrum. So although we tend to think of that as all the colors of the rainbow, that's simply not all of the colors. There must be more to it than that. Spreading colors out on a single one-dimensional map doesn't give us the full set of colors. It has been found from trial and error that it's far better to think about colors mapped out in a two-dimensional space rather than simply mapped out on a line. And many years ago, a commission decided that this is one way of representing a whole load of different colors. It's mapped out in two-dimensional space, and for this particular talk, I am not going to worry about what the two axes are. It's a bit like saying how much green is there in the color and how much red versus blue is there in the color. That's sort of what these axes represent, but we're not going to worry about quantifying. What matters is, effectively, any color can be represented in a space like this. It's complicated by the fact that although in principle we can map out colors in a two-dimensional space, we have to worry about the fact that different technological devices will represent colors in different ways. So we can say that, right, all of the colors of the rainbow are around the outer part of this particular two-dimensional representation. So I've indicated here 400 to 700 nanometers from the violet end of the spectrum through to the red. Notice that the spectrum doesn't cover this bottom line. These are colors that do not occur in the spectrum, like purple, for instance, which is a mixture of red and blue. But they don't occur in the spectrum because the spectrum runs from red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, but not purple. Purple is not the same as violet. They are different colors. But it's complicated because we do have to worry about the fact that my laptop and this projector do not necessarily agree on what color a particular color ought to be. Wherever possible, your phone, your tablet, your laptop, your computer, your projector, your TV, it would be nice if they all agreed exactly what every color in the universe was. But it's a very difficult technical challenge to actually do that. In order to generate colors on the screen you see, the projector, the LCD projector, the liquid crystal display in this projector, is generating red and green and blue, and mixing those colors together. It's generating three primary colors and mixing them together in various ways to try and generate as many colors as possible, which is precisely what my laptop screen is doing as well. But any device, regardless of what they are, will have a limited range of colors. In other words, you can only actually generate colors that are inside the triangle represented by here's my red, here's my green, here's my blue, that I'm using as the three colors that I'm going to mix together. You cannot generate colors outside that triangle. So every manufacturer of a TV screen or an LCD screen is going to try and put the blue of their liquid crystal display as close as possible to this corner, and the red as close as possible to that corner, and the green as high as possible, knowing that it won't be able to display any colors outside that triangle. So the red, green, and blue will ultimately limit what colors you can see. Notice that outside this triangle, essentially all the colors sort of look the same. At the top here, there's virtually no distinction between the various greens that are on the left, the top left-hand side. And also, you notice at the bottom, there's a whole swathe of purple that all looks sort of the same. Because again, it is possible to distinguish colors inside the triangle where you're mixing red, green, and blue in particular ways, but it is physically impossible to generate colors outside that triangle. So here, red, green, and blue are simply representative. They're not necessarily the genuine colors of this projector, and what I see on my laptop screen is similar but not quite the same as what I'm seeing on the screen here. So you do have to bear in mind, whenever you're talking about color, you have to ask yourself, what am I looking at when I'm thinking about those colors? So let's get on with color in the cosmos. I've explained the perception of color, how we quantify color. Let me say a few things about the color of the universe and the color of stars in particular, because I know you're chomping at the bit for the mince pies at the back of the room. When we think about all possible colors, we can ask ourselves, well, although when we go out at night and look up, we tend to see the stars as white, that comes back to the fact that we're seeing the colors of stars with the rods in our eyes, which are not color sensitive. But we know from photographs that stars have lots of different colors. So the question is, if we were to plot out the colors of stars, not necessarily as we perceive them with our eyes, but if we take pictures with a color camera and then see what colors we get for the stars, where would those colors appear on a diagram like this, where in principle we are able to plot all colors? And it's widely believed that, well, stars can be pretty much anything they want to be. There are some red stars, there are some blue stars, presumably there are some green stars, and therefore they would be peppered all over this diagram. But no, the colors of stars are dictated very tightly by the laws of physics. And it turns out that stars can only have the following colors. They can only be somewhere along that line. They can't be anywhere above the line, they can't be below the line, they can't be in the bottom left-hand corner. They can only be somewhere along that line, and the dots or the circles are just representative of a few possible stars. So cold stars, cool stars are over on the right-hand side at the red end of the spectrum. And then as they get hotter and hotter, they go through a sort of yellow and then orangey and then sort of whitish, and then they end up as bluish whitish. Notice that at no time do they go through the top of this diagram. At no time do they go through green. And that is dictated by, we're not going to go through all the detail, but it's dictated by how hot objects behave. When you heat an object up, the radiation from that object, it'll be dictated by, as it happens, quantum theory, which tells you which particular wavelengths of light will be emitted by an object at a given temperature. It's called black body theory, and it states that you can only have certain intensities of certain wavelengths, not any arbitrary intensity you like. So, for instance, when we heat up an object, it goes from essentially invisible, emitting in the infrared, and as it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, then it starts to get reddish, and then it gets red hot, and then it gets orange hot, and then it gets yellow hot, and eventually it gets white hot. But at no point will that lump of stuff turn green. Eventually, if you get it hot enough, it'll go not only white, it'll go bluish white. And whether you're heating up a rod of iron or whether you're looking at a star, it really doesn't make a lot of difference what the material is. All materials that generate light when they get hot will generate the same sort of spectrum, a so-called blackbody spectrum. And let me just show you a few ways that we can visualize this. We don't need to worry too much about the details, but this is a diagram showing how much light is emitted as a function of wavelength. So this is ultraviolet on the left. There's the visible part of the spectrum, and you can see that most of the right-hand side of this graph is at longer wavelengths, so that corresponds to infrared. And what we're going to do is to go to higher and higher temperatures and ask ourselves, how does the light change in terms of the light emitted from an object at this temperature? So at the moment, we're looking at the radiation from an object that's significantly hotter than we are. We are at approximately 300 Kelvin or so, even with the window open. We're at about 300 Kelvin. This is looking at an object over 1,000 Kelvin, which means very little light is generated in the visible part of the spectrum. Most of the light is generated in the infrared part of the spectrum for an object at this temperature. So that's what we're going to look at, the temperature there, and we're going to see how this curve changes. So note two things: how high the curve is and where is that peak. In other words, the peak appears to be about here, somewhere between 2 and 3 micron wavelengths. As we go up in temperature, two things are going to happen. The curve is going to get higher because more light is emitted when an object gets hotter, and that peak, rather crucially, is going to start moving to the left-hand side. At some point, I'm going to rescale this axis because I don't want this graph to be so big it completely goes off the top of the screen. So if we go up to the next temperature, now we're at 1500 Kelvin. Notice that a lot more light is being emitted, and the peak has now shifted a little bit towards the left. It's still mainly in the infrared. Perhaps a tiny amount of light is being emitted in the red end of the spectrum, essentially none in the blue, a little bit in the red. Most of this object, at a temperature of 1500 Kelvin, most of the light is coming off as heat. Most of the light is in the infrared. If we go to the temperature of a relatively cool star, well, this is a very cool star, 2000 Kelvin. This is either a very hot object sitting on Earth or a relatively cold star. Again, we see that most of the light is in the infrared, but notice that there's a considerable amount of light now being generated in the red end of the spectrum. Still, essentially none in the blue. If we get to 3000 Kelvin, that's the temperature of a red giant star. So a red giant star looks red to us, but actually most of its radiation is coming out in the infrared. But clearly a lot is coming out in the red, as indicated by the dot there. There's a little bit in the blue, but there's 10 times as much light coming out in the red as there is in the blue for a red giant star, which is precisely why we perceive it as red, or indeed a camera that takes a photograph in the visible part of the spectrum, it would appear much brighter in the red than the blue, so that would be a red giant star. If we go hotter still to something like the temperature of the sun, the peak has now moved into the visible part of the spectrum. So it's higher and it's moved into the visible. And you can see for an object at the temperature of the sun, the surface temperature of the sun, about 6000 Kelvin or so, we see that there's almost as much light in the blue end as there is in the red end. Yes, there is slightly more in the green, but it's only a tiny difference. Essentially, the sun is emitting at all wavelengths. Unlike the red giant, which was pretty much all in the red and a tiny amount in the blue, for a star like our sun, it's emitting at all wavelengths, which is why our sun looks essentially whitish. It doesn't look emerald green, it looks whitish. And if we take the temperature up still further to above 10,000 Kelvin, now the peak has been shifted. This object is so hot it's emitting most of its light in the ultraviolet part of the spectrum, peaking to the left-hand side here. And notice that because it's peaking over here, it's emitting a lot of blue and a little bit of red. So again, a big difference between the colors across the spectrum. So this object will be emitting a lot of light, but it will be emitting more blue than red. So it'll be a whitish star, but with a definite blue tinge to it, a whitish blue or a bluish white star. So those are the types of stars, and we could go further in either direction, but that would simply just push it further and it would just stay a blue star. Low temperatures, they look red. High temperatures, they look blue. Something like our sun looks essentially white. There's really no such thing as a green star. You think of red, green, and blue. If we have red and blue, why haven't we got green? That's why, because the radiation from stars has to obey the laws of physics, which are dictated by quantum theory. So when we map out the colors of stars, which we often do in a so-called Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, if we look at the surface temperature of a star, which dictates the color of its surface, and we plot out also its luminosity, we find various classes of star fall into various parts of this diagram. But again, the light is essentially reddish or yellowish or bluish. We can compare that with our little picture of what happens if we heat up a piece of iron. It's reddish or yellowish or orangey or white, but at no point does it actually go green. There's our sun, just for reference, luminosity of 1 and a surface temperature of 6,000. So when we look at, for instance, here's just an arbitrary star cluster. It doesn't really matter which one it is. There are lots of stars in there, probably 1 million stars or so, but even by eye, admittedly this is not quite what you would see if you looked through a telescope yourself, but once the camera has captured this by eye, you can see that some of these stars quite definitely have a red tinge, so they're probably cooler, and some of these have got quite definitely a blue tinge, they're definitely hotter. But as much as you would care to look, you will not find a star in there that comes out as distinctly green. If you ever look through a telescope and see something that looks a little bit green, you are seeing the same sort of thing that we saw in that illusion earlier. You are just looking at differences. It might look a little bit greener than other stars in the field, but it's not actually green. It's an illusion of the way you see color. Somebody with more time than they should have on their hands has said, well, there are lots of stars in our galaxy, and there are lots of galaxies out there. So what's the average color of everything? If we were to take the entire universe and smush it all out, what would the average color be? We can look at the spectrum of lots of galaxies, millions of galaxies. We can look at their spectra and figure out where most of the light is emitted, and we can add up all of that and figure out, on the average, what sort of color does the universe appear to be. And somebody has sat down, or at least asked a computer to go through a whole database and extracted the light from 200,000 galaxies, all of them within a couple of billion light years or so of us, and then tried to figure out what is the average color of all of those trillions of stars. And the answer was beige. The most boring color in the universe. They didn't want to call it beige, so they had a little competition to try and come up with a better name for it, and they decided, well, it's one of two things. It's either cosmic latte or my favorite, skyvery, which is a fairly good way of thinking about the universe. So perhaps it isn't so surprising. There are lots of blue stars which are really bright. There are lots of red stars which tend to be fainter because they're at the red end of the spectrum. Remember that graph, not emitting as much because they're not higher temperature. But there are an awful lot of red dwarf stars. So although they don't individually emit as much light, the total number of stars, the total amount of starlight emitted at the red end of the spectrum is similar to the total amount of starlight emitted at the blue end of the spectrum. And so the average comes out as a fairly boring beige. So I am not going to talk about nebulae, and I'm not going to talk about spectroscopy because mince pies are weight. So let me just remind you that the key takeaway from this is your eyes are amazing things, but they do not work the same way as cameras. It does not, your eyes do not simply detect color intensity because of the 3 color receptors in our eyes and send those signals to the brain. It is much more complicated than that, in the sense that the eyes do a lot of the heavy lifting and the processing of the images before passing that information onto the brain, in which the visual cortex of the brain then does the final bit of processing. The colors of stars are determined by the laws of physics. They can't be anything they want to be. The laws of physics dictate that stars, as a function of temperature, range from the red end of the spectrum through white to the blue end of the spectrum, never going through green in the middle there. And what I haven't had time to say this evening, but is covered in the handout if you want to take one of those, is that nebulae work in a different way, and the colours of nebulae are determined by the atoms in the nebulae, not the temperature. Temperature of stars determine their colour. The atoms in nebulae determine the spectra in nebulae, and taking spectra of objects in the universe can be very useful to tell their composition, what atoms they're made of. It can be used to tell how they're moving, and it can be used to tell us about the expansion of the universe. So colour in the cosmos, a really useful concept. Thank you very much for listening.